Blackout Nation. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Adam Barr. Episode 3. The Hospital. Chapter 1. Company. Sarah glanced at Jake's sleeping form, his rifle still propped against his leg. She'd let him rest past the 4-hour mark. He needed it after tailing Marcus's men across half the city. The battery-powered lantern cast soft shadows across their hideout, where Devon and Maya still slept peacefully on their mattresses. In the 6 hours since they'd arrived, the sounds from above had grown quieter. The night shift, Sarah thought, remembering how the hospital's rhythm changed after sunset. She'd worked enough of those shifts to know the patterns. Now those same corridors would be stalked by Marcus's men, instead of nurses doing their rounds. She turned back to Maya's supplies, taking advantage of the quiet to do a proper inventory. Most were basic: bandages, over-the-counter pain medication, antibiotic ointment. Useful, but not enough for a real emergency. Her fingers traced the lapel of their only bottle of prescription antibiotics, mind already calculating doses and scenarios. A soft scraping sound froze her, mid-reach. She tilted her head, listening. The basement's silence played tricks on the ears, but she'd spent enough time in combat zones to trust her instincts. There. Another sound. The distinctive clink of metal on metal, coming from deeper in the darkness. She drew her Glock, glancing at the others. Jake hadn't stirred, exhaustion keeping him under. Sarah moved silently to the edge of their hideout, peering around the lockers. Shadows shifted in the maintenance room beyond. Someone was going through the shelves, moving with purpose rather than random searching. Sarah edged forward, using the rows of equipment for cover. The beam of a flashlight bounced off walls, and she caught glimpses of a tall figure methodically checking cabinets. She rounded the final shelf, weapon raised. "Don't move." The figure spun, hands rising. His flashlight clattered to the floor, beam spinning crazily before settling on a stack of boxes. In the reflected light, Sarah saw an athletic man in his early 30s, wearing scrubs beneath a maintenance worker's jacket. His face was stubbled, dark circles under his eyes suggesting days without real sleep. "Sarah?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah Mitchell?" She kept the Glock steady. "How do you know my name?" "It's Pete. Pete Campbell. I'm an orderly in the ER." His hand stayed raised, but some of the tension left his shoulders. "I brought in that crash victim last month, the one with the neck injury who went nuts. I helped subdue him, so you could administer midazolam." Sarah vaguely remembered the situation, but she'd been focused on the patient, not those around him, and did not recognize the man. "Prove it," she said quietly. "ID. Slowly." Pete carefully reached for his jacket pocket, movements telegraphed. He extracted his hospital ID badge, held it where she could see. The photo matched his face, though in it he looked younger, cleaner, professional. "I've been hiding down here since they came," he said, "since they took the hospital. I knew all the maintenance areas from my shifts, places they wouldn't think to check." He swallowed hard. "I saw what they did to the staff who resisted, what they're still doing." Sarah lowered the Glock slightly. "How many others are down here?" "Just me." His voice cracked slightly. "I tried to help the others hide, but it happened so fast. They knew exactly who they wanted. Doctors, nurses, specialists. They killed the security guards." He met her eyes. Sarah felt cold settle in her stomach. Behind her, she heard the soft pad of bare feet. Maya, coming to investigate. The girl's silent approach impressed her, even now.
"He's telling the truth,"
Maya said softly.
"I've seen him before."
Pete's eyes widened slightly at Maya's sudden appearance, but he didn't seem surprised.
"I've seen you, too. You're good. Better at staying hidden than I am."
Maya looked slightly irritated that she'd been spotted before. Sarah finally lowered the Glock completely.
"We need to talk, but not here. We have a spot."
He nodded.
"Lead the way. I've got some things you need to know about what's been happening since the EMP.
He retrieved his flashlight, clicking it off.
None of it's good.
Sarah gestured him toward their hideout, Maya falling in behind them like a silent shadow. As they walked, Sarah noted how Pete moved, careful, practiced steps that minimized noise. Like them, he'd learned fast, adapting to his new situation in the space of just 48 hours. They settled in the back corner of Maya's hideout, Pete sinking wearily onto an overturned milk crate. Jake had woken at their return, instantly alert, his rifle trained on the newcomer until Sarah explained who he was. Now he leaned against the wall, weapon lowered but close at hand, while Devon somehow slept through it all.
"Start from the beginning,"
Sarah said quietly.
"What happened when they took the hospital?"
Pete ran a hand through his unwashed hair.
"I was doing my rounds on the 3rd floor when the power went. At first, we thought it was just another outage. We'd switched to generators, business as usual."
He gave a bitter laugh.
"But nothing worked. Not the backups, not the phones, not even battery-powered equipment. Then came the first gunshots in the lobby. The team I saw," Sarah said. 7 men, led by a guy with a neck tattoo." "You were here?"
Pete asked.
"I'd already left to make sure Devon was okay," she said, gesturing at the sleeping boy and trying to keep her guilt at bay. "But I passed them as they arrived." "Oh. Well, they came in through the main entrance. I don't know what happened at the start, but I made my way down there and the security guards were already dead. I couldn't get out, though. There were 2 outside, guarding the door, and 1 inside. They were letting civilians out, but rounding up anyone who looked like staff. Then, before I snuck back upstairs, I saw 4 more show up and—"
A deep, unexpected sob broke his narrative. Sarah put a hand on his arm, and he took a deep breath.
"They were turning away accident victims and anyone else trying to get in. But one dad, he was holding his daughter. She was bleeding from a head wound, and he started arguing. They shot him." "Jesus," breathed Sarah. "Just like that, in the temple, no warning."
"I'm sorry you had to see that," said Jake. "I know it's tough, but can you remember anything that might help us?" Pete nodded, making a visible effort to pull himself together.
"The radios. They had radios that worked. I figured that was unusual because everything else was out, even our cell phones. Oh, and I keep hearing them talk about a Marcus. I got the impression that he's important."
"That's their leader," confirmed Jake. Pete nodded, looking down at the floor.
"I felt like a coward hiding from them, but I knew I wouldn't be any use fighting men with guns. Dr. Patel tried to resist when they came for him."
Pete's voice caught.
"They shot his nurse, Lisa, right there at the nurse's station, just to make a point. After that—"
He trailed off, shaking his head.
"Most people stopped fighting."
Sarah's jaw tightened. She'd worked with Lisa for 2 years. "How have you stayed hidden?" asked Jake.
"I used the service corridors."
"Service corridors?"
"Yeah, you know, maintenance, passages, storage halls, staff shortcuts. Places only people who work here know about. Been here 5 years. Learned every back route and hidden corner. Had to, working nights. Sometimes you need a quiet place to catch your breath." He gestured at their surroundings. "Never thought I'd be living in them." Maya handed him a bottle of water. He took it gratefully, drinking before continuing. "I kept moving, staying hidden, watching through service hatches. The ones still here are concentrated in the ER, and they are keeping the doctors and nurses in the observation unit." "But why?" Maya asked. "What do they need all these doctors for?" Pete shook his head. "Don't know exactly, but I've heard things. They talk about preparing for the invasion and medical support requirements. Whatever's coming, it sounds like this Marcus guy wants to be ready." A scream echoed from somewhere, distant but clear. They all tensed, but only silence followed. Sarah felt sick. Rebecca, if she was alive, was up there. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was something darker, more organized. She looked at Devon, still somehow sleeping peacefully, and knew they couldn't stay here much longer. Something else played on her mind, though. She stared into the dim light of the lantern, the shadows dancing across the concrete walls. Rebecca would have stayed, would have found a way to help if their positions were reversed. Her friend's face kept appearing in her mind, determined, compassionate, always putting others first. She'd been that way since Sarah's first day at Mount Sinai, helping her adjust to civilian medicine after Afghanistan. "We can't just leave," she said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "Rebecca's still up there. Others, too." Jake's expression hardened, the same look she'd seen when he'd explained about Marcus's operation at the stadium. "We've got 2 kids to protect. A rescue mission is too risky." "I'm not saying we storm the place." Sarah leaned forward, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Devon. "But we need to at least see if she's alive, if there's any chance. I can help." Pete interrupted quietly, setting down his water bottle. "I know every maintenance corridor, every observation point. There are ways to get close without being seen." Jake studied him, the tactical part of his mind already working the problem, despite his reservations. "How close?" "There's an access panel in the ceiling of the nurses' station, used for maintaining the ventilation system." Pete sketched a rough layout on the dusty floor with his finger. "From there you can see most of the observation ward. They've got 2 guards posted at the main entrance, and 1 patrolling the halls. Sometimes a second roamer, but not always. But my knowledge is limited. I haven't been near it in a while. Too risky." "Any other access points?" Sarah asked, studying his makeshift map. "Service corridor. Runs behind the ER. Maintenance hatch lets you see the whole department. It's how I knew where they are." He paused, considering. "There's also a path through the old laundry chutes that gets you above the pharmacy. Tight fit, but workable." Sarah remembered those chutes from her shifts. They'd been sealed off years ago, when the hospital switched to a centralized laundry system. Perfect for surveillance, if you could stomach the claustrophobia. "I can show you," Pete continued. "At least let you see what you're dealing with." Sarah met Jake's eyes across the dim space, saw the conflict there. He understood about not leaving people behind. She'd seen that in how he'd helped Mrs. Henderson, even if it hadn't ended well. But he also understood about protecting those in your care. Devon and Maya weren't just refugees anymore. They were their responsibility. "Just recon," she said softly. "That's all I'm asking. We look, we assess, we decide." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently checking his rifle's magazine, a soldier's nervous habit. Finally, he nodded once. "These guys, they're organized, but they might be complacent. Having locked down the hospital,
They won't be suspecting any trouble. A soft rustling from the makeshift sleeping area drew their attention. Devin was stirring, probably roused by their quiet conversation. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, then froze when he spotted the unfamiliar figure in their hideout.
"Who's that?"
he asked quietly, instinctively moving closer to Sarah. Pete stayed where he was, careful not to make any sudden movements. He glanced at Sarah, silently asking permission to engage with the boy. Sarah nodded slightly.
"Devin, this is Pete. He works at the hospital with me."
Devin studied Pete with the cautious curiosity of a child who'd learned the hard way that strangers weren't always safe.
"You're a doctor?"
"No," Pete said, keeping his voice gentle.
"I'm an orderly. That means I help the doctors and nurses. I used to work in pediatrics sometimes. That's where we take care of kids." "Oh."
Devin seemed to consider this.
"Did you know my Aunt Sarah there?"
"I did." Pete smiled slightly.
"She's one of the best nurses we have. Taught me a lot about helping people."
Devin relaxed slightly at this praise of his aunt.
"What are you doing?"
he asked, noticing some medical supplies that Pete had spread out on the floor as he talked to the others. Pete glanced at Sarah again, who gave another small nod.
"I was just organizing some bandages. Want to learn how to roll them properly? It's kind of like making a sleeping bag for your finger."
This earned a small giggle from Devin, who edged closer, his natural curiosity overtaking his caution. Sarah watched as Pete patiently demonstrated the proper technique, explaining each step in terms the boy could understand. There was something about Pete that put Devin at ease, maybe because he represented a piece of the normal world they'd lost, or maybe just because he knew how to talk to kids without talking down to them. Sarah took advantage of the moment to pull Jake aside, moving far enough away that their whispers wouldn't carry.
"Just reconnaissance,"
she said again, meeting his eyes.
2 hours maximum. We get eyes on the situation. Then we make an informed decision."
Jake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was learning meant he was wrestling with a difficult choice. "And if we see Rebecca? If she's alive but we can't get to her? Will you be able to walk away?"
"Could you, if it was someone you served with?"
The question hung between them. They both knew the answer. He sighed, but there was a hint of a smile beneath his exhaustion.
2 hours. We look, nothing more. No engagement, no rescue attempts, no heroics. Maya stays here with Devin, maintains security. Pete guides us in and out."
He held her gaze.
"Agreed?"
Sarah nodded, relief flooding through her.
"Agreed."
They moved back to the others. Maya was preparing a bowl of cornflakes and long-life milk from the supplies she'd managed to pilfer. Sarah put an arm on her shoulder.
"Thank you, Maya. You're a lifesaver."
The girl smiled proudly as Sarah knelt beside Devin, who was still focused on his bandage rolling. His small hands worked with careful precision, trying to match Pete's example.
"Devin, Jake and I are going for a walk with Pete while you have your breakfast. We'll be back soon, okay? Maya's in charge. You listen to her."
Devin looked up, his eyes too serious for his age. He hugged her tight, and she felt him trembling slightly.
"Be careful." "Always am, buddy."
Maya handed him the bowl and took up position near the entrance, her posture straight-backed and professional.
"Be safe and as quiet as possible,"
Jake said to Maya quietly. "No lights, no sound. Anyone comes close—"
"I know,"
Maya interrupted with a hint of attitude.
"Stay hidden, keep Devin safe."
Jake smiled.
"Copy that."
They moved toward the door, Sarah taking a final look at their makeshift sanctuary. Maya stood ready to bolt the door behind them, her face serious in the lantern light. Devin ate his cornflakes, worry still evident in his eyes.
"Ready?"
Pete whispered. Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission tension settling in her shoulders. The weight of her Glock was reassuring against her hip as she checked it one final time. Across from her, Jake performed his own weapon check with practiced efficiency. Lead the way. They slipped into the darkness, and Maya gave a final wave before closing the door softly behind them. Darkness swallowed them quickly, and Pete flicking on his penlight was more of a relief than Sarah might have admitted to anybody. They moved quietly and quickly along the corridor, then up steps to the first floor. Chapter 2. Opportunity. Pete led them through the darkness with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years navigating these hidden spaces. His penlight beam barely touched the ground, just enough to avoid obstacles. Sarah moved behind him, with Jake bringing up the rear, his rifle held ready. The maintenance corridors were a maze of pipes and conduits, the air thick with the smell of old dust and machine oil. Their footsteps, no matter how careful, echoed softly off concrete walls. Every so often, Pete would pause, holding up his hand for silence as voices or footsteps passed above or beyond the walls. "Watch your head here," he whispered, ducking under a low-hanging pipe. "2 more turns, then we're at the access point for the observation ward. We'll need to climb up between the walls to reach the ceiling space." Sarah's nerves tingled with pre-mission tension, just like Afghanistan. The familiar weight of the Glock at her hip was reassuring. She'd cleaned it thoroughly after their firefight at Jake's house, knowing she might need it again soon. Pete stopped at a narrow gap between 2 concrete walls. "This is going to be tight," he breathed. "We have to go up about 20 feet. There are maintenance holds cut into the concrete, but they're old. Test each one before you put your weight on it." He went first, wedging himself into the gap and finding the first handhold. Sarah watched his technique, the way he kept his body flat against one wall, using opposing pressure to maintain stability. It was like rock climbing in reverse, in the dark. Sarah nodded and followed Pete into the gap. The space was claustrophobic, barely wider than her shoulders. She had to turn her head sideways to look up, following Pete's slow progress. The handholds were rough-cut divots in the concrete, spaced irregularly. Some felt solid, others shifted worryingly under her fingers. Above her, Pete disappeared into darkness. Then his hand appeared, reaching down. "Almost there," he breathed. "There's a ledge here." She grasped his hand, and he helped pull her onto a narrow maintenance platform. The space opened up slightly here. They were in the ceiling void between floors. Dust tickled her nose, and she fought back a sneeze. Jake emerged a moment later, movements silent, despite the rifle slung across his back. They crouched in the darkness, letting their eyes adjust. Thin strips of light leaked through seams in the ceiling panels, creating a dim grid pattern. "This way," Pete mouthed, pointing. "Panels right above the nurses' station. Gives us a view of most of the ward." They crawled forward on hands and knees, testing each section of flooring before putting their weight on it. The ceiling structure wasn't meant to hold people. One wrong move and they'd crash through into a world of trouble. Sarah's world narrowed to the space immediately around her. The ceiling void was a maze of pipes, ducts, and electrical conduits. Cobwebs brushed her face. Every small sound seemed magnified, the subtle creak of structural members, the soft whisper of their clothing. Pete stopped, pointing down. Through gaps in the ceiling grid, Sarah could make out the nurses' station below. Her breath caught as a familiar figure walked past. Dr. Patel, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled. He was carrying an armload of supplies, head down.
They arranged themselves carefully around the access panel, a removable section of ceiling tile that maintenance workers used to access the ventilation system. Sarah ended up between Pete and Jake, all three lying flat to distribute their weight. From this vantage point, they could see most of the ward. Just as Pete had described, 2 guards stood at the main entrance, weapons held ready. They looked bored but dangerous. A 3rd guard patrolled the hallways in a regular pattern, passing below them every few minutes. The ward itself had been converted into a makeshift prison. Sarah counted at least 15 medical staff, doctors, nurses, technicians. They moved with the defeated shuffle of captives, performing tasks under the watchful eyes of their guards. Her heart clenched when she spotted Rebecca, helping an elderly doctor with bandages.
"Your friend looks okay,"
Pete whispered.
"They're keeping the medical staff in relatively good condition. They need them healthy."
Sarah nodded, studying the scene below. The guards were well armed, but relatively few in number. If they could somehow isolate 1 or 2 of them. Suddenly, running footsteps echoed down the hallway, and the 2 guards became alert. Another appeared, breathing hard.
"Johnston's been hurt. Some kind of accident with the generators. Bad bleed."
"How bad?" one of the entrance guards asked.
"Arterial. They need the doctor now."
The guard cursed softly. "Patel, Mitchell, you're needed. Move it." Sarah watched as Rebecca and Dr. Patel were hurried from the ward. Only the new guard went with them. The other 2 stayed to watch the rest of the prisoners. She met Jake's eyes in the dim light. They didn't need words. Both knew this might be their only chance.
Chapter 3. Extraction.
"Through here,"
Pete breathed, already moving.
"Service tunnel runs right behind the ER."
They crawled backwards from their observation point, careful not to disturb the ceiling panels. Sarah's heart pounded with a familiar mix of fear and anticipation, the same feeling she'd had before combat operations in Afghanistan. But this time, it was Rebecca down there. This time it was personal. Jake touched her ankle, signaling a halt. Footsteps passed directly below, then faded. They reached the maintenance shaft and descended one at a time, Pete leading them through a different route than they'd come up. This passage was narrower, forcing them to move sideways at points. Pipes hissed softly around them, carrying pressurized air to different parts of the hospital.
"Wait,"
Pete whispered, stopping suddenly.
"Listen."
Through the wall, they could hear voices. The ER wasn't far.
"Hold pressure there,"
came Rebecca's voice, professional despite everything.
"Dr. Patel, I need that cart."
"Where's the damn suture kit?"
A man's voice. The guard, Sarah guessed. "Got it," Patel responded calmly. "But we need better light. The batteries in that lamp are dying." Pete pointed to a metal panel in the wall.
"Observation port," he mouthed. "Used for checking pipe integrity."
Sarah nodded, already understanding. Jake positioned himself on one side of the panel, rifle ready. She took the other side as Pete carefully loosened the panel's edges. A thin slice of light appeared. Sarah peered through, analyzing the scene with combat-trained eyes. The ER was dark, except for a battery-powered surgical lamp casting harsh shadows. Rebecca and Dr. Patel worked on someone lying on a gurney, one of Marcus's men, bleeding heavily from a leg wound. The guard stood near the door, assault rifle held loosely, more concerned with the medical procedure than security. Amateur, Sarah thought. In his position, she'd have maintained proper situational awareness, kept scanning the room. But he was focused entirely on the injured man. She caught Jake's eye and made a series of quick hand signals. Old military shorthand they both understood. He nodded once. Time to move.
"On my mark,"
Jake breathed, so quiet Sarah barely heard him. 3, 2.
A clatter from the ER interrupted. Dr. Patel had knocked over an instrument tray. The metallic sound seemed deafening in the darkness. The guard spun toward the sound, his shadow elongating in the harsh battery-powered light. "Sorry," the doctor said quickly, hands raised apologetically. "The light." "Just keep working," the guard snapped, taking a step closer to the gurney. His rifle hung loose at his side as he watched the doctor's work. "How much longer?" "Hard to tell in this light," Patel responded calmly. Perfect positioning. The guard's attention was completely focused forward, his back exposed to the maintenance panel. Sarah felt Jake shift beside her, muscles tensing. They'd done similar takedowns 100 times in training. Jake moved first, pushing the panel open in complete silence. Sarah was right behind him, Glock already drawn. 2 steps took them through the opening. The guard never heard them coming. Jake's rifle butt caught him behind the ear with surgical precision. Not enough force to kill, just to incapacitate. Sarah was there to catch him as he crumpled, controlling his fall to avoid noise. His weapon clattered softly as she lowered him to the floor, one hand supporting his head to muffle any impact. Rebecca spun at the sound, a bloody suture needle still in her hand. Her eyes widened, recognition and disbelief warring on her face. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, but her hands remained steady. Sarah pressed a finger to her lips, already pulling zip ties from her pocket.
"Sarah?"
Rebecca whispered, shock and hope battling in her voice.
"How did you—"
"Keep working, Beck," Sarah told her, efficiently securing the guard's wrists behind his back. The zip ties would hold him long enough. She grabbed his radio and weapons, passing the rifle to Jake, then looked at her wide-eyed friend.
"We'll get you out of here. How stable is he?"
"Femoral bleed," Dr. Patel reported professionally, not missing a beat as he continued suturing. His hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the poor light. "Caught it early enough. The artery's clamped and I've got the major bleeders tied off. But we've got it controlled. 2 minutes to finish." Jake secured the door while Pete slipped in through the maintenance panel. "We need to move fast," Jake said. "They'll expect a progress report soon." Sarah performed a quick sweep of the ER, checking sight lines and potential threats. The battery lamp cast strange shadows, creating blind spots she didn't like. But the room was secure for now. Amazing how quickly old combat instincts returned.
"How many more guards between here and the exit route?" 2 patrol the connecting corridor,"
Rebecca said, her hand steady as she assisted Patel. She passed him another suture without being asked.
"Regular pattern, every 10 minutes, like clockwork."
"They just passed," Patel added, tying off another stitch with precise movements. "We have 7 minutes before they return." Sarah met Jake's eyes across the darkened room. 7 minutes to get 5 people through hostile territory.
"Pete,"
Jake whispered, checking the magazine in his newly acquired rifle.
"Options?"
Pete moved to the ER's main doors, peering through the narrow window.
"Well, the main corridor's clear, but we need to cross it to reach the service corridor. It's about 60 feet down on the left. What about this patient?"
Rebecca asked, over her initial shock at the appearance of her friend and the other 2. She watched Dr. Patel as he closed the last suture. Her instinct to finish the job they'd started was strong. "He'll live," he said, clearly not as concerned with this patient as he would have been under normal circumstances. "Bandage him." Sarah checked her watch. 5 minutes until the patrol.
"Pete, tell me about this service corridor." "Maintenance access behind radiology. Run straight down to the basement, but—"
He hesitated.
"We'll have to pass under the guard post at the east entrance."
Jake was already moving, gathering supplies into a small pack. "They won't be looking down. Sarah, how do you want to proceed?"
"Pete on point. He knows the route. Rebecca and Dr. Patel in the middle. Me, then you bring up the rear."
She checked the unconscious guard's restraints one final time. Then her gaze fell on Patel and Rebecca.
"Any questions?"
Rebecca shook her head, stripping off her bloody gloves. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her eyes were clear.
"Lead the way."
They moved to the door.
Sarah could feel the tension radiating from everyone, the mix of fear and adrenaline that came before any operation. She touched Rebecca's arm. "Stay close. Move fast. If anything happens, hit the deck and we'll handle it." "Just like your combat stories?" Rebecca managed a weak smile. "Never thought I'd be living one." "Movement," Jake whispered sharply. They pressed against the walls, holding their breath. Footsteps approached. A different patrol, passing early. Sarah's hand tightened on her Glock. If they checked the ER. But the steps continued past, fading toward the cafeteria. Pete released a silent breath. "Now," Sarah breathed, "before they loop back." Pete eased the door open. The corridor beyond was dark, except for emergency lighting casting pools of sickly green light every 20 feet. He checked both directions, then darted across to the far wall. Sarah watched his technique with approval, fast but silent, staying in the shadows. She gestured to Patel. The doctor hesitated for just a moment, then followed Pete's path. His footsteps were louder than Sarah would have liked, but he made it. Rebecca went next, moving better. She'd clearly been watching Pete's technique. 4 seconds of exposed ground, then she was safely across. "Go," Jake whispered to Sarah. "I've got our 6. Sarah crossed last, feeling horribly vulnerable in the open space. But then she was pressed against the far wall, pulse pounding in her ears. They'd made it. Or so she thought. A radio crackled in the distance. "Jenkins, report status on Johnston. Jenkins! Somebody get eyes on the ER." They were out of time. Pete led them to an unmarked door, fingers opening the lock with his master key. Sarah could hear voices growing louder from the direction of the observation ward. The door opened with a soft click. "Come on," Pete rasped and ducked through the door. They piled through into a narrow hallway with a concrete floor. 15 feet further on, it led to a narrow metal staircase, down into darkness. As Jake was just pulling the door shut, they heard a shout from the direction of the ER. "They're gone! Where the hell is Patel and the nurse?" "Lock down the floor. Check every room, every closet." Jake locked the door from the inside. "Go!" The stairwell smelled of rust and old cigarettes. Their footsteps, no matter how careful, echoed off concrete walls. Sarah moved close to Rebecca, steadying her friend when she stumbled on the uneven steps. Sarah felt Rebecca trembling beside her. "Keep moving," she breathed. "They don't know about these passages." "The others," Rebecca whispered, gripping Sarah's arm. "We can't just leave them up there. Lisa's sister is still there, and Dr. Chen, and—" "We'll come back for them," Sarah promised, though her heart ached at the lie. "But right now we need to move." They continued down, Pete leading with his small light. The beam caught pipes and conduits, creating strange shadows. 2 flights down, he held up his hand. "Crossing under the east guard post," he mouthed, and put a finger to his lips. They could hear voices, guards chatting, unaware of what was happening just beneath their feet. A cigarette butt dropped through a grate, trailing sparks in the darkness. One agonizing step at a time, they crept past. Sarah counted her heartbeats, waiting for an alarm, a shout of discovery. But they made it. "Wait," Patel whispered, grabbing Sarah's sleeve. "There's something you need to know about what they're planning." "Later," Jake cut him off quietly. "Right now we need to move." 3 more flights down. The basement felt miles away. Sarah could feel Rebecca shaking beside her. Exhaustion, fear, or both. Even Dr. Patel's normally perfect posture was slouched with fatigue. Suddenly, Jake grabbed Sarah's arm. She froze, hearing what he'd caught. Footsteps above, moving fast. Someone else was in the maintenance corridors. "They're searching," Jake said. "The whole hospital will be locked down, once they call for backup." "No time to be careful, then," said Sarah. "We run, now." They descended the last 2 flights at dangerous speed, no longer worried about noise. Sarah's knees ached from the impact of each step. Behind them, shouts echoed through the stairwell. The search was expanding. Pete took them through a maze of corridors, finally stopping at a familiar door. Sarah's heart clenched, thinking of Devon and Maya waiting inside. They'd have to move fast. The children couldn't be here when Marcus's men started a proper search. Maya's voice came from inside.
"Who is it?"
"It's us," Sarah said quickly. "Open up. We need to move." The door opened. Maya's eyes went wide at the sight of their expanded group. Her gaze lingered on the two newcomers, clearly calculating what their presence meant. Devon launched himself at Sarah, wrapping his arms around her waist.
"I heard shouting."
"No time," Jake said, already gathering supplies. "They'll figure out where we went soon. We need to be gone before they call in reinforcements."
"The drains to the river?"
Sarah asked. Jake shook his head. "They'll expect that. We need another way."
"I might know one,"
Rebecca said quietly.
"but you might not like it."
Above them, the sounds of the search grew closer. They could hear radios crackling, orders being given. Soon the hospital would be flooded with armed men. Chapter 4. Rumors.
"We'll take anything at this stage,"
said Sarah.
"What's your idea?"
Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper.
"There's a tunnel that connects the hospital morgue to the old medical school, across the street. They used it to transport unclaimed cadavers for the students years ago. It hasn't been used since they built the new facility a decade ago, but as far as I know, it's not been filled in." "Why would we want to go to the medical school?"
Maya asked, shouldering her carefully packed bag. Her eyes kept darting to the door, monitoring for threats just as Sarah had taught her.
"Well, it's empty,"
Rebecca explained quickly, wiping sweat from her forehead with a trembling hand.
"We'll be able to catch our breath and decide what to do."
Jake was already checking his weapon, efficiently scanning the magazine before replacing it. "How far?"
"Maybe 200 yards,
Rebecca said. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, testament to what she'd endured the past 2 days.
"But the tunnel's sealed. They closed it off when the school closed."
"Sealed how?" Sarah asked, helping Devon put on his backpack. The boy was being remarkably quiet, sensing the tension in the adults around him.
"Just welded shut. The maintenance crews did it when they decommissioned it."
Rebecca ran a hand through her tangled hair.
"But the welds are old, and the metal's rusted. I used to take smoke breaks down there sometimes. The door's not as solid as it looks."
Pete was moving before she finished speaking, heading to a maintenance locker in the corner.
"I know where we can get those tools. They keep the heavy equipment down here."
He worked the lock quickly. A crash echoed from somewhere above, followed by shouting and the thunder of boots on stairs. They were running out of time. "Show us," Jake said, positioning himself near the door where he could watch both approaches to their position. They moved quickly through the basement corridors, Pete and Rebecca in the lead. The morgue was in the oldest part of the hospital, and the air here was different, stale and heavy with damp. Sarah felt Devon press closer to her side.
"It's okay, buddy,"
she whispered.
"Just stay close." "Here,"
Rebecca said, pushing the morgue's double doors open. The room beyond was dark, lit only by dim emergency lighting. Metal gurneys lined one wall, their occupants covered by sheets that seemed to glow faintly in the weak light. The cloying smell of disinfectant didn't hide the underlying smell of decay. Devon pressed closer to Sarah.
"Are those—" "Don't look," she said softly,
turning his face away.
"Just stay close to me."
Maya's eyes were wide, but she kept moving, her gaze fixed firmly on Pete's back. Sarah saw her swallow hard when they passed a gurney where a hand had slipped free of its sheet. Pete led them through the morgue, weaving between examination tables and storage cabinets. The room felt endless in the dim light, each shadow concealing potential threats, or worse.
"Through here,"
Rebecca whispered, pointing to a heavy door marked Medical School Access, Authorized Personnel Only. Patel touched Sarah's arm again.
"Please, what I heard, it's important." Tell us while Pete works, she said,
watching as the orderly attacked the door's welded edges with tools from his pack.
There's a safe zone, the doctor said quickly. The state militia in Ohio has established a secure area. They're taking in refugees.
He glanced nervously at the morgue entrance.
But Marcus, he was talking about attacking it. Once he has enough men, enough medical support for casualties. That's why he's gathering doctors, supplies.
A metallic screech made them all jump as Pete worked on the welds. Devin whimpered softly.
How do you know this?
Jake asked, still covering the entrance.
The guards talk. They think we're too broken to listen. But I heard Marcus talking to them on the radio yesterday. When he finally has control of the city, he wants to attack that safe zone before they get too big.
Gunfire and shouts sounded from above them, closer now.
Almost there,
Pete grunted, attacking the final weld.
But it's going to make noise when it gives.
Sarah looked at the frightened faces around her, Devin clutching her hand, Maya trying to be brave, Rebecca and Patel exhausted but determined. They needed more than just escape. They needed a destination.
A safe zone, she said quietly. If we can make it there.
A loud crash from behind them made them all jump. Maya bit back a scream.
Got it,
Pete hissed as the door's seal finally broke. The tunnel stretched away into darkness, its concrete walls slick with moisture. The air was stale, thick with the musty smell of abandonment. Pete's small light barely penetrated the gloom.
We need to block their way in case they find the tunnel, Jake said, pulling the door closed behind them. Help me with these gurneys.
There were several old gurneys lined against the tunnel wall, probably left from when the passage was active. Sarah and Pete helped Jake drag them to the entrance, while Rebecca kept the children back from the worst of the rust and decay.
Stack them, Jake directed. Make it look like they've been here forever. If anyone opens that door, I want them to think this tunnel's been blocked for years.
They worked methodically, creating a barrier of tangled metal. Jake wove old chains through the frames, making them harder to move. The whole thing looked like it had collapsed there naturally years ago.
Good enough, Sarah said finally. They'll search the morgue eventually, but hopefully we'll be long gone by then. Stay in the middle, she told the kids, positioning them between herself and Rebecca. Maya, hold Devin's hand.
They moved down the tunnel, their footsteps echoing despite their best efforts at silence. The beam of Pete's light showed regular support pillars, their concrete surfaces black with mold. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping steadily. Devin jumped at a particularly loud drip.
I don't like it down here,
he whispered.
Neither do I,
Maya answered softly, squeezing his hand.
But sometimes the scariest path is the safest one. Like in games, the hard levels have the best loot.
Sarah smiled, despite everything. Maya had a way of reaching Devin that constantly surprised her.
How far?
Sarah asked Rebecca.
50 yards to the medical school access,
Rebecca answered, helping Patel, who was struggling with the pace.
There's a stairwell that leads up to the basement level.
This safe zone, Sarah said quietly, falling back to walk beside them. Tell me more. It's being organized by the Ohio National Guard, Patel explained, his breathing easier now that they were walking instead of running. They're gathering survivors at an abandoned Air Force base. They have power, supplies, medical facilities. And Marcus plans to attack it?
Patel nodded grimly.
It's what he said, but who knows?
There!
Rebecca pointed to a metal staircase barely visible in the gloom.
Up!
But as they reached the stairs, Sarah's heart sank. The access door at the top was chained shut.
Pete?
She asked urgently. He was already moving, tools in hand.
On it. This is old chain. Shouldn't take long to cut through.
Sarah glanced back down the tunnel. Everything was quiet. No signs of pursuit, yet. But she knew that wouldn't last. Eventually, they would search the morgue. Eventually, they would find the tunnel. But it might be hours, or even a day, depending on how many men they had and how quickly they searched. By then, they needed to be far away from the hospital. And maybe, just maybe, They had a destination now. Pete worked on the chains methodically, each scrape of his tools echoing in the tunnel. The bolt cutters he'd grabbed from the maintenance locker were old, but effective, slowly biting through the rusted links.
"Almost there,"
he whispered.
"One more."
The chains split with a sudden crack that made them all jump. Jake caught it before it could clatter down the stairs, lowering it silently to the ground.
"Door's still locked," Pete said, examining the handle. "But it's just a standard key lock. Give me a minute."
Sarah watched him work while the others caught their breath. Devon had finally stopped trembling, though he still held Maya's hand tight. Rebecca sat on a step, head resting against the wall, while Dr. Patel checked the dressings on his scraped hands. A soft click, and the door swung open with a groan of unused hinges. "Careful," Jake said, taking point. "We don't know what's up there." The stairwell opened into a large storage room. Emergency lighting cast a weak glow over abandoned shelves and equipment. The air was stale, but not unpleasant, just unused.
"Close that door,"
Sarah said, once they were all through.
"Block it like the other one."
They found a heavy storage cabinet that took all of them to move, shoving it against the door. Jake wedged a metal pole under the handle for good measure.
"What is this place?"
Maya asked, looking around with interest.
"Anatomy lab storage," Rebecca answered. "They kept specimens and models here when the school was open."
She pointed to some sheets covering large shapes.
"Those are probably the plastic cadavers they used for teaching."
Devon edged away from the covered forms. "We need to find somewhere defensible," Jake said, "preferably with multiple exits."
"Faculty offices are 2 floors up," Pete offered. "Private bathrooms, break room with a kitchenette. The whole building's been closed for years, but it might still have supplies." "Windows?" Sarah asked. "Some, but they're small. The building was designed to minimize distractions for students."
Jake nodded. "Show us." They moved through the abandoned school like ghosts, their lights catching empty bulletin boards and dusty display cases. The silence was absolute. No distant sirens, no sounds of searching men, just the quiet of a building long forgotten. The faculty offices were through a set of heavy fire doors. Inside, a long hallway branched into individual rooms, each with its own nameplate, now thick with dust.
"Break room's here," Pete said, leading them to a larger space. "Has its own emergency exit to the back stairs."
Sarah surveyed the room critically. 2 doors, both lockable. Small windows set high in the wall. Cabinets that might still hold supplies. More importantly, the room was large enough for all of them, but small enough to defend.
"This will do," she said.
Rebecca collapsed into a dusty chair, while Patel began examining the kitchenette's water pipes.
"Think it still works?"
Sarah asked him. He turned on the faucet, and water flowed.
"Looks like it. The building's been closed but not officially decommissioned. I know they have a cleaning team in here monthly."
A small cheer from Devon interrupted them.
"Found cookies!"
He had pulled a cupboard door open. Behind him, Sarah saw a jar of instant coffee, packets of powdered creamer and sugar.
"They're probably stale,"
Maya said practically, but she was already opening the cookies.
"Wait,"
Sarah said, checking the expiration date.
"These are still good."
"Must belong to the cleaners. I'm sure they won't mind now," said Jake, holding his hand out for a cookie. The next hour was spent organizing their finds. Several packages of emergency supplies, probably left from some long-ago safety initiative. A first aid kit, some bottles of water, even a few changes of clothes in a lost and found box. "We need a plan," Jake said finally, returning from his patrol of the floor. "They'll figure out where we went eventually." Sarah nodded, spreading out a city map they'd found in one of the desks.
"Ohio's east. We need to put our supplies together and divide them up for carrying. I might know where to get a vehicle," Pete offered. "There's a maintenance garage 3 blocks from here. They store the hospital service trucks there."
"Unless it's pre-1970s, it'll be useless,"
Jake said. "The EMP fried anything with the electronics. When we leave, it'll be on foot."
"This isn't enough food for all of us," said Rebecca. "We'll need to raid a supermarket, but I guess we can get out of the city first."
"You don't need food for me. I'm not coming," said Dr. Patel, firmly. "I'm going to find my wife." The group fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. "You've all been kind, but my path is clear. If she's out there, I have to try. Good luck to you all." It was clear from his tone that he would not be dissuaded, and frankly, who were any of them to try and talk him out of it? He held out his hand to Rebecca, and she brushed it aside and hugged him, her eyes brimming with tears.
"Be careful, Rakesh."
"I will, and I'll make sure no one sees me on the way out." He gave a short, awkward wave to the rest of them before disappearing through the stairwell door without looking back. Jake's brow creased with worry.
"Don't worry. He's a clever man. He won't give away our position,"
Sarah said. "I hope so." "Anyone else have other plans?" he asked, looking at Rebecca and Pete pointedly. They both shook their heads.
"I'm single," said Pete. "Only been in the city for 3 months. Moved from Idaho. Sarah knows I'm a bitter old spinster," said Rebecca. "I'll tag along."
"Okay, we'll go tonight," Jake said. "No moon and no power. It will be easier to stay hidden in the dark, and we should try to make it out to the city fringes by first light." Sarah traced their potential route with her finger.
"We'll need to cross Morrison Bridge. Think it'll be a problem?"
Jake shook his head. "Maybe when it first happened, people trying to get out of the city and stuff. Now I think it will be just one big parking lot." They spent the next hour planning, marking potential routes and fallback positions. Devin had fallen asleep on a small couch, his head in Rebecca's lap. The nurse stroked his hair absently while they talked.
"We should sleep," Sarah said finally. "Take watches until then, and move out at 10 p.m.
"I'll take first watch," Jake offered.
"Let me," said Maya. "I'm not tired, and you guys only got a few hours sleep. I'll wake you if I hear anything, I promise."
Sarah started to object, but Jake caught her eye. The girl had proven herself repeatedly. She deserved their trust. "Okay, 2-hour rotations," he said. "But you wake me in 2 hours. I'll take the second, and Sarah can take the third. Rebecca looks beat, and so does Pete. So you guys can do first shifts tomorrow night, when we're out of the city." No one protested, and they quickly set about making the room more secure, barricading doors and creating sleeping spaces from old cushions and abandoned coats. The rest of the cookies were shared out, along with some of the water. As Sarah was about to bed down, she noticed Devin's eyes were open, still heavy, but alert. She lay down next to him and pulled him close.
"What's wrong, buddy?" "Are we going to make it?" he asked quietly. "To the safe place?"
Sarah pulled him close.
"Yes, I promise. We've got good people with us now. Strong people. We'll make it."
He nodded, seeming satisfied.
"Like a team?" "Exactly. Like a team."
Sarah watched him drift off to sleep, thinking about his words. They were a team now, thrown together by circumstance, but bound by something stronger. Survival, yes, but also hope. Somewhere, east of them, across miles of broken city and desperate people, there was safety. They just had to reach it. She checked her watch. Just over 7 hours to go. 7 short hours to rest, to prepare, to gather their strength. After that, they'd face whatever came, together. The end of Episode 3, The Hospital. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Adam Barr.
If you're enjoying Scott's audiobook content, please like and subscribe. It's the best way to help out the channel.